Okay, and of course, we have to learn about Calvin, BB's assistant. So Calvin had a big round face. Calvin said, Mrs. Jules, I want you to take notes to Mrs. Zarves for me. Miss Zarves? asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarves, said Miss Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. So remember their school's really tall? Okay, that's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for, asked Miss Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we've already established the fact, said Miss Jules. The 19th story, Calvin repeated. Yes, the 19th story, said Miss Jules. Now, take it to her before I lose my patience. But Miss Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Miss Jules. Unless you'd rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Man, that kindergarten bus is getting a lot of people. Like, whenever they get in trouble, they gotta go on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin, and he slowly walked out the door. Huh, laughed Terrence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom, and he didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways, but he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built oh, that's interesting. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. I wonder where he's going to go then. There was also no Ms. Zarves. Okay. Ms. Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Ms. Zarves. I'm getting confused. Besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Okay, this is getting a little suspicious here. Miss Jules had never given Calvin a note. Boy, this is urgent, thought Calvin. Or this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist, who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, then back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There was never a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Kind of reminds me, like in Harry Potter, the platform 9 3/4, like maybe there's like something he's missing. I don't know. Calvin walked down to the administration office, and he decided to put a note in Ms. Zarves' mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Lewis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Lewis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Lewis always seems to know what to do. He's got a lot of good advice that he seems to give these characters. We always come back to the yard teacher. Hey, Lewis, Calvin called. Hi, Calvin, said Lewis, and he tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Lewis tipped it in. You want to play a game, Lewis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarves up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here, Lewis asked. There's no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where's Miss Zarves, asked Lewis. There is no Miss Zarves, said Calvin. What are you going to do with the note, asked Lewis. We know, there is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Lewis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. Very simple, said Lewis. You're not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Miss Jules I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Lewis. The truth is always the best. I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Miss Jules' class. That's a lot. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, Miss Jules interrupted. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yeah, but you see, said Calvin, you delivered the note to Miss Zarves on the 19th story, asked Jason. How'd you do it? What do you mean, how'd I do it, asked Miss Jules. Or how'd he do it, asked Miss Jules. He gave Miss Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Miss Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important, said Miss Jules. I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Miss Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin. But really, it was nothing. Interesting. I feel like that's not the last that we've heard from the 19th story. All right, this next chapter, we are going to meet Myron. He's got a very mischievous look about himself. So that's Myron.